name is Ram Venkatesh. I'm the CTO at Cloudera. It's a pleasure being here today. Thank you all for attending. I know I am the guy between you and the rest of the evening's entertainment, so I do appreciate you coming in on the late start. So, let's see, clicker works? Okay, good. So a little bit about myself, just a couple things. I've been in the data space now for, I guess, 3 decades. I'm a very slow learner when it comes to data. So if there was a database that you loved or hated, chances are I did something to it over the years. I've been with Cloudera for a long time now. It's been exciting to kind of see the whole big data ecosystem and that journey happen in real time in front of us. A third bit is open source is the thing that's most fascinating for me about this space and this approach to analytics, right? So this was one of the things that attracted me to Cloudera in the first place was how can we build an analytic platform and an ecosystem around open source. So we'll start at the very top, right? Today's talk, the next 20 minutes or 18 minutes, I figured that rather than show more of what our products can do, is to spend more time around the use cases and the why. Like, how does what we are doing relate to what you're hearing about generative AI? So we'll spend most of the time around an outside-in, customer-centric viewpoint. I feel that in general, that's a nice way to think about the applicability of the technologies that we bring to the market, right? So why Cloudera? This is probably the last product portfolio slide in the whole deck, right? So this is, Cloudera is probably the original hybrid open data platform, right? Synonymous with big data for most of the last 10 or 12 years. It's quite likely, if you had heard about Cloudera in the past, it was in the context of Hadoop. So my one cheesy joke for the night is, for the last 5 years, our mission has been to go from the Hadoop era to the cloud era, right? So when Hortonworks and Cloudera merged together, we really took a hard look at the architecture and said, what can we do to create a forward-looking architecture for this data platform? And it came down to actually being cloud native. Right, so we've embraced cloud native in the data stack very fundamentally to the point where all of our core engines are available now in 2 form factors. So whenever you hear Cloudera talk about data services, these are the new containerized form factors. And then when you talk about data hub or base, these are our cluster offerings. And think of these cluster offerings as very transitory offerings that will help customers from where they were with the previous platforms to running with the new version of Cloudera, which is the Cloudera data platform, right? The bottom line on this slide is actually the key thing to take away is that this kind of a re-platforming is usually fairly risky for anybody to attempt, especially a large platform company. So as of this year, more than 75% of Cloudera customers are actually running CDP today, right? So this is where we've fully migrated over from CDH and HTTP to the new platform. So that's kind of where we are from a product portfolio, what do we do standpoint, right? By the numbers, we are just crossed $1 billion for the year, which is usually, it's a milestone in a software company's lifetime. We're very grateful and proud that we accomplished that last year. When it comes to managing data, right, this is where Cloudera really shines. The more data there is, the better for the platform. So we manage about 25 exabytes of data. It's hard to get too precise on this because a lot of our customers are actually in the federal and the intelligence business, and they only share indicative sizes of how much data that they have with us. But a way to think about this number in human terms is this is about a quarter of the world's data at this point in time, which is a pretty amazing thing if you think about it, right? So the addressable internet is about 25 exabytes, and Cloudera's estate is about the size of the addressable internet. And of course, Gartner thinks we're cool, so that's always good. So if you think of, why do we have this adoption? What are the cool customer use cases for us, right? It's really three trends. The explosion of data should be a no-brainer to folks who are attending this conference. But what's interesting there is couple points. One is we are seeing that about 75% of the data that's in our stack is actually unstructured or semi-structured data. And that's the piece that's growing fastest. Right? A tangential data point is S3 just announced last year that they crossed 200 trillion objects. Right? Most of that is semi-structured or unstructured data. So that's where we're seeing a lot of our growth. The second is we're also seeing a lot of growth in the number of people who use the platform, right? So if you think of, a few years ago, we'd have a few hundred people on a Cloudera platform. Most of them would be data engineers working on pipelines. That is no longer the case, right? So now we have data scientists, we have analysts, right? So you have literally thousands of people on the platform, which has meant that we had to take a look at how we onboard people onto the platform. There's no way we are going to be able to train all of these users on anything Cloudera. Nobody has time for that, right? So we opened up the ecosystem with our open data lakehouse architecture to allow lots and lots of engines, lots and lots of third-party tools, so people can just bring their learning over as is and get on the platform. The third, of course, is the need for speed, right? People want to make sure that they can actually uptake technologies as fast as they can to meet what the business is asking them to do. So these are sort of I would say, the key trends or drivers, no major surprises there, but the elephant in the room is really generative AI, right? So this is, if you see the adoption of generative AI just in the consumer space, it's amazing that ChatGPT, the app that OpenAI released, hit 100 million users in 2 months. And this is not a flash in the pan, right? So we're seeing a lot of interest. People are able to relate to use cases very, very clearly, saying, oh, I can do that with my business, right? If I had this ability to search all my documents in this way, that sort of a thing, right? So there's a lot of interest in our customer base about how they can actually leverage natural language and conversational AI to build out use cases across a whole bunch of different verticals. If you think back to that 75% unstructured data, that makes sense. Because what is the first thing that they would do today? They would do something called ETL to throw away the 99% of the data that they could not address because it was unstructured. Finally, generative AI gives customers access to that. So as data professionals, right, so this is where we see this a big, large shift that we are seeing in the market, right? So I laid out sort of, if you think analytically in the last decade, what has the journey looked like? We all didn't get into this because we loved SQL. We got into this because Spark and MapReduce were fundamentally new ways to analyze all your data. You could do things you could not do with SQL. But it turned out that was really hard. If you think of all of the Spark programmers in the world, there's still not enough of them to actually satisfy the demands of mainstream enterprise America, right? It's for this reason that we ended up actually supporting SQL in the stack in the way that we have. So SQL sort of, instead of going from like Spark programmers, now you could actually hit SQL analysts. There's a lot more of them in the world. If you think of Spark all up, there's probably like 25, 30,000 people. It's probably 2 million people trained on SQL, right? So in exchange for that, though, we really started going back to analyzing smaller amounts of data. We did this very cleverly. We said, oh, you can run ETL, right? But we would throw away most of the data, and then that top of the pyramid is kind of what we could analyze. The expectation with generative AI is that we can go one more turn of the crank. Instead of insisting on SQL, now we can actually have people pose questions in natural language. A lot more of them around, and it is natural language, right? So one of the cool things about a platform like ours is we run in 84 countries, right? So there's no way we're going to be able to like localize and reach these users where they are. Generative AI gives us a chance to do that. This year we've been doing our events for Cloudera all over the world, and we've been showing this generative AI demo. Today's session is too short that I can't show that to you, where we would enable rich search over enterprise data. We did that in English here. We did that same demo in Paris, in French. We did this in Spain, in Spanish. We did this in Tel Aviv in Hebrew. And we didn't have to do any of the work other than just make sure that the prompts were set up right, the system was configured correctly to actually enable natural language in a whole wide set of scenarios like this, right? And the other thing is that with natural language and with generative AI, we're able to address all of the data again. So it's not just the top of the funnel, right? So if you think about this, this is how we see this transformation happening, is that today's stack kind of looks like that pyramid. You start off with all your data. Step one is ETL. You get to, you start with a petabyte, you end up with 5 to 10 terabytes. This is very typical in our stack, okay? And then that's what you actually come in through SQL. The promise of generative AI is that this picture, and it wasn't even one pyramid. It turns out that for every use case, there is such a pyramid, which is why many of you run hundreds of pipelines, thousands of pipelines. You're recreating these these very opinionated relational data sets on top of all of this data over and over and over again, so that you end up with these really small, high-value data sets, right? So with generative AI, the promise is that you start with all your data, you go through this process of vectorizing them and extracting meaning once. And once the embeddings are created, you can now answer a whole bunch of questions against the same data set. Right, so this considerably reduces the amount of duplicate effort that goes in. It lets you literally ask bigger questions, right, from the stack, because now you pose the questions in English. So we think this is extremely transformational for us. It's not going to be overnight. This is great. So why hasn't all this happened already today, right? I would say, there's also challenges with generative AI, with trust and alignment and privacy and regulation and all of the other parts. So one way to think about this as data professionals, I find this lens to be fairly useful for us, is over the last decade, we have seen this movie before. When Spark came out, they told us, Cloudera is dead. You guys have to close your shop because the whole world is going to be Spark. They were right that Spark was going to be really popular, but Cloudera was the biggest place to run Spark for a very long time. We still are. A tremendous number of Spark workloads run on Cloudera today, right? But that transition was very helpful for customers. And you can see, every 18 to 24 months, something comes along that is truly transformational. That's the cool thing about being in this business for us, right? LLMs are the next wave. So I think that if you look back and say what's really working for our customers through this journey is having control over your data is key. Today, for example, if you had given over all of your data to a SaaS provider who specializes in SQL, and we all know one or two of them, when generative AI comes along, you need your data back, because their SQL engines are not going to be the ones who are going to be really good at generative AI, right? So you have control over your data. It lets you take advantage of that in ways that you did not really consider at the start. The second piece is that regardless of how good any processing engine is, there's going to be another one, right, 2 years from now. So having that flexibility to support multiple engines, we think, is really important. But the third piece is that we want to be able to make sure that you can innovate constantly, right? So the idea is that generative AI is not just for this consumer-facing scenario. It's for you. As an analytics professional, you need to be thinking about which of my pipelines make sense in this context. So we want you to move fast to take advantage of the shifts that are happening, but don't do it in a way that locks yourself in, right? That's the balance that we see a lot of our customers going through. So for example, OCBC Bank out of Singapore, they deployed generative AI today. They're running in production on Cloudera, using Cloudera machine learning, Cloudera's data platform, and the rest of our data ecosystem. They rolled out 3 use cases. It was very interesting to hear the guy in charge of them. He even spoke at an internal company event for us to tell us sort of how that went. He's been doing public webinars. It's been really good and educational for us to see how they think about generational AI is mainly about actual tangible savings that they can see. Something that used to take 30 minutes now takes 5 minutes, and that's the saving that they can pass over, right? So Wingman is a developer productivity tool. They have the same number of developers that they did before they released this tool. They just made them more productive. They launched Wingman 5 days after GPT-3.5 was released. Right? So it was pretty quick as to how they could actually adopt and roll out these kinds of use cases. So I talked a little bit about challenges and risks of adoption. We believe that enterprise context is the main piece that is missing. So out of the box, Cloudera enables generative AI, bringing your data that's sitting in a Cloudera data lake into the context of generative AI. That's one of the things that we are doing. The second thing that we are doing is around data in motion. Right? So today, if you think about most pipelines are set up to actually convey data from source to target as efficiently and as fast as possible, right? We see that, that's sort of, I view that as the core data acquisition, data ingestion kind of use cases. What we are seeing with generative AI, it's really more and more about intelligent data movement. There's no reason that you can't actually do a lot more with the data that is on the wire. Sources and targets are really important. We get that. Right? So Kafka is an important source. But the processing that you can do between your source and your data lake is an opportunity for you to actually do significant amount of enrichment. And we are seeing that across across verticals, across velocity, whether you have a lot of data but that's slow moving, or whether you have, many of our telcos, they process terabytes of data every day through our platforms, and these are very, very small pieces of data, right? There's usually a Kafka at one end, sometimes Kafka at both ends of the wire, and then there's intermediate processing that they want to do. So this is where NiFi really fits in, right? It's because on-the-wire data processing is really, really important, right? So if you think of, some of the things that we can do in the NiFi Designer, here we go. So it's really, the net out of all of that is that you have a programmatic way to author a set of flows, right, where you can take advantage of data visually from a whole bunch of sources. There are a bunch of processors that we support for doing things in flight, right? It's interactive, it's production ready, it's scalable, secure, and it supports all of the flexibility that you will need from an enterprise standpoint. So this is sort of where the sweet spot for NiFi is in non-trivial processing that you have to do. If you had to move events from Kafka to S3, there's lots of ways to do it. But if you actually need to create a vector embedding in the middle, right, to extract semantic content from a PDF as it's flowing through your system, that kind of a flow is very, very natural for NiFi to take part in, okay? So NiFi 2 is a new release for us, and one of the things we are very excited to announce is support for Python as a standard first-class part of the offering. We've always had support for Python in NiFi, but it was like a second-class citizen where Java was the primary way. A lot of the AI libraries, a lot of the NLU libraries, a lot of the toolkit, the tool chain for building generative AI apps is very Python-friendly, very Python-centric. This was the big reason that we did introduce this shift, was to actually add support for Python. So along with that, you can see that NiFi is really good at processing lots of different kinds of data, right? So whether it's structured, unstructured, text data, video data, audio snippets, things of that nature, the analysis that you have to apply to each one of these is considerably different. So you can think of the NiFi processor model has the flexibility to enable you to process a whole bunch of different types of data. And you can do all of this while still being inside of that security and governance envelope that you need to be from an enterprise perspective, right? So overall, that's sort of what the architecture would look like, is that you would have NiFi with custom processors for actually interfacing with your generative AI libraries. And then once the data lands within the purview of your data lake, then there are other open source engines that you can actually use to work on the data. I want to point out one thing. At the end of this, you will see, usually, traditionally, we've used NiFi to bring data under management. But we're also starting to see a lot of use cases where people are using NiFi to actually have that data be materialized in systems outside of Cloudera, right? Systems like Snowflake, for example. So a very common pattern that we see is that regardless of what vendors want, right, it looks like polyglot ecosystems are here to stay. So customers routinely, they have some Cloudera, they have some Snowflake, they might have some Databricks, they might have a couple more cloud-native services, and they want data processing and analytics to happen across all of these different walled gardens. And we find that NiFi is a good way for you to stitch together patterns like this. Of course, we would love for you to use Cloudera's engines wherever it's appropriate, but we acknowledge that there are use cases where you may want to go outside the stack. So in terms of just a couple things, call to action type stuff at the end, right? I have a minute to go. The Cloudera Stream Processing Community Edition is a very, very convenient way for you to get started. I've spoken a bunch about AI, some about NiFi. I did not say a lot about Flink, but Flink is one of the key assets in our streaming platform. Right? It enables SQL and now also support for the other languages in that programming model. So you can get started with, Cloudera has been in the Flink community for more than 4 or 5 years now. So we have customers running Flink in production at scale today. So this is a really convenient way for you to actually try Flink. The other thing that I want to also just flash up here is the NiFi product, the ecosystem that I talked about. It's available in our public cloud form factor. So this is a a managed PaaS offering from Cloudera, where Cloudera has a control plane that you can sign up for, and the data plane resides on your side of the house. Right? So all the data and all the compute, all the processing happens on your side of the house, but there's a centralized multi-tenant control plane that you can log into. So there is a free trial that you can sign up for. You can go through that experience. And that's a pretty easy way for you to actually experience what a NiFi flow authoring as well as deployment process looks like. So hopefully that gives you a few ideas on how you can think about data in motion and generative AI at the same time. Thank you all for listening.